Implant Champions webinar. We're really pleased that so many of you could join us today. Unai is going to share the slides and do the slides for us. So if you could do that, Unai, that would be great. Great, thank you very much. So my name is Anne-Marie and I'm part of the organising group along with Lenore and Unai, who are both with us today. You can see on the videos. Martin is also part of the group, but he's not joining us today, but I've just put his picture down there so we don't forget about him. I want to say a very special thank you to all the people that have contributed towards this initiative, either with their support or with their time or with resources. And most of all, thank you for all the champions for signing up, and the mentors for supporting them, and for kind of realising that there is a need and there's a gap in clinical provision in this area. So thank you very much. We go to the next slide. We've got a great panel with us today. We've got two champions who are going to talk about their audits, Joseph and Katie. And we've also got people from each manufacturer to talk about what training they can provide to help you to support your team and your service in this initiative. Next slide, please. So the agenda today was based on feedback from the conference in March, the BCIG conference. I'm just going to hold it there actually because I can't see subtitles at the moment, and I know that we wanted captions on. Is it ticked on there? Can anyone else see them? Great. I'll just let that, yeah, it's listening to me, great. So thank you everybody for joining today. We've got a great panel of people, clinicians and champions, who will be able to share their audit work and talk about how they can offer training and support for you in your services. The agenda today is based on feedback from the conference in March. We asked you at the end whether you felt confident to do audit in your service, and overwhelmingly the answer was no. So we knew that we needed to do more training on audit. We also didn't have enough time for case studies, and a lot of you had submitted great case studies that we wanted to talk about. So we're going to talk about those today. And we thought it was really important that you understood what the manufacturer engagement teams can provide, how they can help you, how they can support you, because they're a really important part of being able to have day-to-day support in between the training that we set up and provide. So initially, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction now. So we'll say goodbye to all the other panelists. They're going to put their cameras on when it's their time to talk. And if we go to the next slide. Oh, back one. Great. So hopefully all of you have been to the BAA Champions website that Victoria's put together. It's a really great resource, and it's there to sort of clearly define what the role of the champion is. And it's very much about supporting your team. So it's somebody in the team who's going to support the rest of the team with training, making sure people feel confident to talk about implants with their patients. This initiative is about offering patients a treatment option. It's not about everybody having an implant or everybody even being referred for an implant. It's about eligible patients understanding what an implant can provide and having that choice. The audit part is really important in terms of understanding how implant referral is working in your service. And if you're wondering if this initiative is important, then I would recommend that you read this paper in Ear and Hearing about barriers in implant referral. It's a very recent paper, and it talks about the barriers for patients in terms of fear of the operation, fear of losing their residual hearing. It talks about barriers for referring clinicians in terms of a lack of confidence in having the discussion, lack of confidence identifying candidates, and those two things work together to mean that often this conversation doesn't take place, or it's a very short conversation and the patient's fears aren't able to be explored or addressed. Next slide, please. So we are really pleased with the response that we've had to this initiative. We've got 83 champions and it's increasing all the time. There's a spread across the UK. There are other initiatives going on across the country. So I know Yorkshire, they do a lot of training in their area, and Wales, North Wales have a lot of training as well. We've had a really big response from the east of England and the southeast in terms of this initiative. So it's really, really encouraging. Next slide, please. I want to talk about a very important publication that was released in August of this year. It's an international paper, a consensus paper, which means that they looked at all the evidence, they did a systematic review, and they had an expert panel from across the world, including members from the UK. There's a great summary of their work on a website that I've highlighted there in red. And it's a really big milestone in terms of a standard of care for cochlear implant services. And if we go to the next slide, please, they came up with 7 statements, 7 important areas that need to be improved or considered. The first statement was around the level of awareness of cochlear implants. And their findings were that actually people were being referred late for an implant. An increasing amount of time had passed, 10 or 15 years since they were eligible before they were referred. There was a low awareness of cochlear implant as a treatment option among patients and among clinicians, and a low awareness of actually what the candidacy criteria was for a cochlear implant. So this was one of 7 in terms of highlighting that this is an area that needs more work and needs addressing. We go to the next slide, please. And they showed a really interesting graphic in terms of the uptake of cochlear implants around the world. Now, we know that cochlear implants improve not just how people hear speech, but actually their quality of life and how they can live their life can change dramatically. So we know they're effective, but we also know that the uptake is very, very low. And if we move on to the next slide, we can kind of think about that in a bit more detail in the UK. So there's enough literature to know that the uptake is low, possibly around 7%. And actually, that's not the full picture, though. We know that some adults will go to an implant centre and have an assessment and decide not to have one or be determined not to be a candidate. And we know that around 50% of those that go to an implant centre are actually implanted. So that means actually the number that are assessed is much bigger. It's around 14%, 16% of the eligible adults are assessed. If we then think about, well, actually, that's not the full picture, because often implants are discussed with an individual and they don't want to go for an assessment for a wide variety of reasons. But actually, the literature shows that that number's quite low. So 70% of those offered want to go on for an assessment. So that only means that we're increasing this number to number offered to around about 23% of adults. Now, some of the rest of those aren't being offered. Some won't want one. They'll be part of the deaf community. It won't be at all suitable for them. They won't want to go down that route. Some will be unsuitable for other reasons. But actually, some adults won't be aware that an implant is an option for them, because either it's very infrequently discussed, maybe once every 10 years, maybe very infrequently, or actually the conversation's very short. It's a very short conversation. Maybe the patient says, oh, I don't want an operation, and then there's nowhere to go really, because the clinician isn't confident to then talk them through that process. So the numbers are unknown, but the audit work that will be presented today is really interesting to start looking at the numbers potentially that aren't having an implant discussed with them. Okay, next slide, please. So I think it's really important for us to remember that for referring clinicians like myself, having a conversation about a cochlear implant is not an easy conversation. Cochlear implants aren't part of our practice. We don't meet people who have an implant, very rarely, if at all. So it's hard for us to know what the outcomes are with an implant, what difference it will make. It's hard for us to know how the rehab works, how the surgery works. And often there's a bit of a kind of circle of sort of a cycle here where often the training and the teaching about implants is very much focused on the technology, how the implant works, which is important, but often the candidacy and how you actually have that conversation with somebody about the implant isn't part of the education. That can then be kind of reinforced in placement because the conversation isn't happening a lot. Students don't see the conversation, they don't observe it, they don't get to try having the conversation. So then that they don't come out as a newly qualified audiologist with the skills to have that conversation. What we hope this initiative will provide is ongoing CPD, which will embed implant referral counselling into everyday practice, and that will then have an impact on what's seen on placement. Students will see it on placement, they will observe it, they will get involved, and also this support system for newly qualified audiologists, that somebody will mentor them through that process of talking about implants and that experience. They'll gain that experience. And most of all, it's moving away from this idea that implants are not our area. They are our area because so many of our patients are eligible for them, that we have to be able to talk about them well and confidently and identify candidates confidently. Next slide, please. And there was a really interesting talk which probably prompted me to sort of do more about this. It was at the BAA in 2019, and it was by Sarah Allen from what was then the Ear Foundation. And she talked to audiologists, referring audiologists about implant referral. And these quotes really kind of strike home that actually people are just left on their own with this. They've got feel like they've got very little guidance, very little support to have this conversation. We go to the next one. And the result of that for patient care is that people are being referred late, or they're not being referred at all, or they don't have the full information, the full options available to them to make the decision. So a really big implication for the patient, and that's really what this Champions initiative is about giving clinicians the confidence to have the conversation so that every eligible adult that wants one understands what they can provide and what they can offer. Next slide, please. So hopefully I've covered all the points that are in this slide in terms of why we need this initiative. I think the most important one is probably the bottom one, is that this change, why does it need to be driven by referring audiologists? Well, it's because we're the audiologists in the clinic that see these patients. The implant teams know that there are patients they're missing. They know they're not getting the number of referrals that they need, but they can't access those patients. They don't have direct access to them. We do, we see them, they come through our clinics, they're on our databases, they're in our services. So we're the ones that really need to lead this initiative, but we need the support of the implant teams, and that's where the mentors come in to offer that support. Really important part of the process. Next slide, please. We've tried to group some resources available, and all these are available online. They've all been sent out to the champions, and this kind of resources growing all the time. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's resources in progress as well, that you'll see being published and coming out. And anything that you think is missing, anything that's needed, please let us know, and we'll endeavour to try and create something that can be useful. There's lots of people working on this. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to audit now before Joseph and Katie talk about the great audit work that they've been doing. The audit cycle is very clear in this situation, that you audit the referrals, you share your results, you train and support the staff, you change your practices, and then you re-audit to see whether that's actually helping and having an impact. We go to the next slide. This was a question that was asked before the March training. You can see that often actually services are very unsure about the number of people that they're referring over for an implant, and often the numbers are very, very low, less than 5, very small percentages. So where these initiatives have been run in Manchester, in the northeast, referral rates have gone up by 3 times or 4 times what they were before, showing that actually the numbers, especially since the NICE criteria, are likely to be much bigger that we need to be referring over. Next slide, please. In terms of the audit and the audit tools that we've got available, the audit's actually a very straightforward audit. We've got a very clear gold standard for adults, which is that all adults that are suitable should be offered an implant, should be discussed, an implant should be discussed at the assessment. That's in the NICE criteria for adult assessment. The paediatric one is it's not clear. When should an implant be discussed? And a paediatric audiologist, please contact me and we can discuss this about what the gold standard should be for paediatrics. In terms of finding the patients, it's very straightforward because we've got the PTA criteria, again, based on the NICE guidelines for cochlear implantation. So we can find our patients, we can do it on a report system in Audit Base. There's a report for Practice Navigator, which has been shared by one of the champions, Louise Fletcher, thank you very much. So that's going to be shared with everybody. And you can also search by clinic. If all your severe profounds are seen in a clinic, you can search by the clinic to do it. The difficult part is sometimes categorizing the patients because actually they've got very complex histories and backgrounds and you're trying to determine whether they're suitable or not. So these categories, we've created a group of us that are doing audit, and I hope by sharing them it will make the audit process easier. The top three are very straightforward. They were referred or they declined or they need more assessments. It could be that they need more testing, they need another hearing aid fitting, that type of thing. The more difficult ones are not referred because they're unsuitable, and actually clearly defining what unsuitable means is what I'm going to do next, or the ones where there was no action taken. So no action taken means that they were suitable, but the discussion didn't take place. So what do you do about those ones? Well, actually, there's a range of things that you can do, and it will depend on the patient and the individual situation. In the Northeast, they sent out an information leaflet, which I've actually attached to this webinar that you can adapt. So Lisa Kennedy kindly shared it with us. So it's a way of sharing information and inviting patients to get back in touch if they want to talk about it more or if they want a referral. Depending on the numbers that you have in this no action taken group, you might want to discuss it with your mentor at your local cochlear implant centre to see how they want to address those numbers. Do they all need to have an AB word test? Is there some online virtual information sessions that could be arranged of how you're going to actually talk about implants with these patients? If we go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about the ones that are unsuitable. So I wanted to have a really clear list of what is unsuitable, because I think if you ask 10 audiologists, you get 10 different answers. And actually, even within this very clearly defined list of what's unsuitable, there's still lots of situations where there needs to be a discussion with your mentor about particular patients. So primarily it could be that the person, in terms of illness, if they're actually end of life or it's an acute illness, otherwise any chronic conditions that doesn't exclude them. Whether it's a mental health condition, a learning disability, a physical condition. In terms of the PTA, then yeah, the PTA does need to meet the criteria unless the person has very, very poor speech recognition, as shown on a speech test, and then that could still be suitable. So I've tried to do a list here, but you can see that on the notes section, a lot of the time it's a discussion with the implant team, just to clarify that person is unsuitable. We'll go to the next slide, please. So in terms of an audit schedule, there's a really clear baseline kind of audit that you can do to look at the year when the criteria was changed, so March 2019. How was your service performing in that year? So it was before anyone had had any champions training, before COVID and the clinics closed, but after the criteria changed, to look at the patients that in that and categorise those patients and see, and that's what Katie and Joseph have done. Then after that, hopefully there's going to be changes, training, support, resources created, and then you're going to carry on auditing the service. Maybe you might audit every month, every other month, 1 week of a month, but there's going to be an ongoing audit to check how your service is changing, to check that it is changing and things are, the numbers are changing and more people are being offered. This isn't a definite guide of how you do your audit. It's very much up to you, whatever suits the time you've got, the service that you've got, but some sort of audit so that you understand what referral counselling is going on, who isn't referring, which members of staff need more support, what types of patients are being missed, is it certain audiograms, is it certain health backgrounds that are being missed that can really support your training. Next slide, please. And that's where it links into how to use these audit results. It's not just about understanding the numbers, it's about using those numbers to do something, to implement a change within your practice. the audit is a great way to share the information with your team, share case studies. It's a great way to identify what training needs to be done, which staff need more support, focus on misconceptions, think about the more formal training that might be offered by implant teams, and then some staff can go and have that training. So you're really kind of creating a plan of how you're going to train and support your staff based on your audit results. Next slide, please. And actually having service users in, so referring audiologists get to meet service users, they get to hear what an implant's done for them. That's a really important aspect. We did this at the university for the students, and this is where it really struck me that we don't see this as referring clinicians. We don't see them again. We don't hear their story, and it's such an important part of motivating us to talk about implants with our patient. And then again, around this sort of supporting newly qualified audiologists, making sure that this is about offering people informed choice, shared decision making with the patient. Next slide, please. So this kind of whole process is about a team. The Champions Initiative is not about you being the one person in the service that can talk about implants and understanding them and everybody gets sent to you. It needs to be a team approach, because sometimes the patients might drop into the service desk and they might want to have a conversation about an implant or an implant referral. And it's important that staff are ready to have that conversation, because if staff go, oh, I don't know anything about implants, then no, it's not going to give the patient very much confidence that this is part of audiology and part of the treatment options that we provide. And also, all staff can pick up candidates, people who've had recent reviews, they've got updated hearing aids, but they're still struggling. Is it because they're actually needing different technology? The patient as well, empowering the patient to be part of the process, leaflets, posters, get them talking about implants, get them asking about implants, and also think of your mentor as part of that team. You're going to be somebody you contact, you're going to be asking them questions, and they're going to be part of the process as well. So there's lots and lots that audit can fit into, and how it can help and raise awareness within the team and motivate staff and link into training. We go to the next slide. So this is where I'm going to hand over to Joseph, and he's going to talk about the audit work that he's done in Southend. I'll just let him come on. Hi, Joseph.
Hi there. Oh, great. So if we go back to the last slide, there we go. So yes, I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience doing an audit at Southend Hospital. So much like a lot of other champions, I came away from the last presentation thinking about how I would actually do the audit. So I sought out some way to do that. What we used was a very early version of a report that Cochlear provided for us, the Cochlear CI referral report. And we used that successfully to produce our first report in this, the way that Anne-Marie was saying, doing a year looking back at our patients. So as a brief overview, we found that 5% of all the patients that we found to be eligible were referred onwards. And out of the group that were found that weren't referred, 52% had documented reasons for no referral, and 43% had no action recorded, so there was no documented reason for why there wasn't a referral. So this got us thinking. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about sort of generating the report because it's an early version of it, but essentially it's a report that you run from the user reports section within AuditBase, and you have a custom report that's put in there. You define your parameters such as the date range that you want to look for, and then you can export it. We were exporting it into an Excel file format because that was the one that worked best for outputting the data. Next slide. So breaking down our audit process, we had to run that report and output the data to Excel. And then we were going through and manually looking at each of the patients that it had scooped up and to see whether they were actually in criteria, and then to assign them an outcome status, so whether they'd been referred or whether they had some other documented reason. We then output all that data, and we were looking for those patterns, such as was it certain groups of patients that weren't being referred, ones with certain configurations of hearing loss, to see if there were any patterns we could pick out from that. And then we wrote up that report as an audit, and then that was shared on with our recommendations based on the patterns that we'd found. So with following the audit cycle, next year we'd want to re-audit and make that more so that we could compare back to the data that we got this year. On to the next slide. So being a very early version, we did have a few issues with running this first audit. First of all, the main thing is that it's quite time consuming. We were manually going through and looking at all of those patients. That's something I'm hoping will be improved with experience and also with newer versions of the report. And then generally running the early version of the CI report meant that some aspects that have later been refined we didn't quite have at the time. So those will be improved in later versions, and the data output will look a bit neater in later versions. And then, as I mentioned, we haven't got any previous audits to compare that data to, so it's really a standalone at the moment. And then in the future, hopefully, the data that we've got will look better comparing it to future audits that we do. Next slide. So what did we learn from all of this? So feeding this data back to staff, we found that a lot of them were surprised that there was that large percentage where there were no actions recorded, because a lot of staff sort of remember having these conversations with patients. And the general feeling was that a lot of the time maybe there are quick conversations and the patient might decline quite quickly, or maybe they don't feel confident to have that full conversation, but there isn't anything documented. Even if there has been a decision made, it might not be documented in the journal. And if it wasn't documented, then it wasn't scooped out when we were doing our manual reporting. So this really highlighted that better record keeping would be a good idea, and this could potentially save us time in future audits, and we might be able to save further time if we're putting particular alerts, either hotkeys or parameters, onto patients so we can scoop that data out faster. But even if this process were automated, I think manual checking or rechecking would still be useful to sort of to verify the quality of the data that we're pulling out. Next slide. So where are we going to go with this in the future? So a lot of the stuff that Anne-Marie's alluded to, we want to present this data to staff and make recommendations based on it. So we want to ideally get more accurate and precise documentation of the actions that were taken in an appointment. And we generally want to promote a better awareness of the new CI criteria, so that professionals that are maybe not so aware feel more confident in having these discussions. In upcoming staff meetings, we want to open up the forum a little bit and talk about how we would actually implement these changes. So we may consider modifying our existing hotkeys within Audit Base to make the record keeping easier to do and easier to view when coming back to audit it. And we want to discuss potentially using the parameter function within a patient's file, so that we can make it easier for future reports and future audits to scoop that data out. And then, as I say, just generally open up that discussion about when we want to have these discussions with patients. Should it just be in our reassessment appointments when we've done a hearing test for a patient, or should it be potentially at every appointment? And we want to be looking at hearing tests that are coming in from other professionals as well. Is it our responsibility to have that discussion with patients that maybe we haven't seen have been referred to us? So I just want to, in the future, to get feedback from staff and see how we actually want to adjust our service going forwards. So hopefully that gives you a brief overview of how we did our audit at Southend. Even with the early version of the reports, we managed to do an audit and it was very successful, and it's really prompted a lot of ideas for the future. So hopefully other departments can too. So that was my section there.
Thank you. Thanks, Joseph. That was great. So Katie will now talk about hers. Katie, are you able to come online?
Yeah.
Great.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you.
Lovely. So next slide. So I'm based in North Devon, and we're quite a small audiology department, and we refer up to Bristol. So we wanted to do the Cochlear implant audit because we were unsure of the numbers of CI referrals that were happening in the department, but the general consensus was that people were declining referrals, but we weren't sure why. And we wanted a much quicker and easier way of doing an audit, so we joined forces with Cochlear for the Cochlear CI referral report. But there are lots of different ways you can do an audit, obviously, which Anne-Marie sort of advised you earlier. And also, we just generally wanted to improve our service in regards to these patients who are eligible. And because the referral criteria changed, suddenly there's a huge population of people that were now eligible. that we just didn't know where they were, and so we wanted the audit to be able to find these patients. The next slide. So like Joseph and Anne-Marie have sort of discussed, we followed a very similar audit process, and it was very quick to do using a report. We'd done audits manually in the past for other things, and obviously they always take a lot of time. So we used the report, and then we looked at all the patients who had been seen within the past 12 months whose audiograms were within the 2019 cochlear implant referral criteria. These patients were then, once they were identified, we then looked back through the journals whether they'd been offered a CI, whether they'd accepted it or declined it, and also whether they were unsuitable or whether there was any information in the journal at all. And then we looked through the reasons on the journal for why they'd been declined, or if there was no reason for any discussion occurring, and then these results were then fed back to the team. But obviously having that conversation is quite difficult with your team, so it's having that confidence to do that in the first place, but also then generating those ideas as to what we can do to improve it. The next slide. So what I found was that we generated a report that found 108 patients who'd had a PTA between March 2019 and March 2020. And we then put the, so within AuditBase you can put predetermined parameters. So we added parameters in for all the patients that were identified, which helped us then determine the percentages as to who'd been referred, who hadn't, who'd declined, and who'd had discussions. And we also were able to put in the unsuitable criteria. So next time we audit, these patients will already be identified, which should make life a little bit easier. So next slide. So what we found, as you can see from the pie chart, was that actually 51% of our patients out of the 108 hadn't had any discussion, which was quite surprising, a little bit disappointing as well. So that's something that we're really focusing on now. But what was pleasing to see was that 13% were referred, 19% had declined, so they'd actually had the discussion, so that was really good, and 17% were found to be unsuitable. And the unsuitability criteria equated to people or to reasons such as that they'd had a bar half fitted, or they were non-verbal, and sort of criteria such as those. The 13% that were referred, these referrals will often happen in reassessment appointments, and that's usually 5 years after they've been fitted, which seems like quite a long time really. If you are struggling, 5 years is a long time. So again, that's something we're hoping to think about. And for the 51% that had no discussion, this was sort of provoked thoughts about, you know, what was stopping us from discussing cochlear implants and recognising these patients. And obviously there's been a lot of work going on about that, and that's something that we're really concentrating on in our department. And for the 19% that had declined, when we looked through the journals, for a lot of people it was that they found travelling to the implant centre was too much. And for our patients, this is over 2.5 hours in the car, there and back. So it's quite a big commitment really. And patients were often subjectively happy with their hearing aids, which again was quite a surprise. And we don't do speech testing in our department currently. Again, this is something we're hoping to think about. Or not routinely anyway. So again, that was something that hopefully we're going to address. And others were unwilling to commit to the process. And the operation often puts them off. And again, I think that has occurred because we're just not very good at talking about it. We're not very good at discussing it with patients. And like Anne-Marie said, we're not addressing those fears, and that's something that we need to improve. So if you'd, next slide, please. So changes to clinical practice that we've identified and that we've come up with in North Devon are things like improving the reporting of CI discussions in patient notes. So obviously making sure that everything's documented, which we should be doing anyway, but just making sure that we are. And we're also hoping to develop an alert or a prompt after the PTA that says if the patient is within criteria or not, because this will really help with sort of making sure that in that busy clinic, when there's lots going on, the patient's talking at you, that you're actually remembering that, oh yeah, that patient is a CI candidate, or oh no, they're not, therefore you don't need to have that discussion at that point. Also planning to have some more cochlear implant training to build confidence, and sort of also creating a referral pack for patients specific to North Devon and the pathway that we have, in that we can then give that to patients who are sort of borderline, thinking about it, aren't quite sure, they don't want to commit quite yet, to give them something to take away, give them something to discuss with their families, give them something to think about, and then hopefully when we see them again, those discussions can then be developed. We're also hoping to improve communication with the implant centre. So like Anne-Marie said, linking in with the CI mentors, and just improving those discussion pathways, and making sure that the referral pathways are smooth and smooth as possible for our patients. We also want to introduce an AB word list clinic for those patients who are borderline. It would be really good to say, actually, look, you know, your hearing aids aren't working as well as perhaps we'd like them to. Why don't we try a CI? So it's all those different things that we're trying to introduce, and sort of obviously everything takes time, everything's slow progress, but hopefully by introducing each one as we sort of go through the year, in 12 months time when we come to re-audit, we'll hopefully definitely see some of those comparisons, and it might be that we get to re-audit earlier, so perhaps change one thing, re-audit, see what the change is, and then go from there. But yeah, definitely lots of exciting things happening in the world of cochlear implants, which is brilliant. Thank you very much.
Oh, great, Katie, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing your work. I thought it was really interesting what you said about the slow progress. It does take time to implement changes, and it might take as much as 12 months to really see a big change in your referral pattern. That's what I found in my last service. So it's worth just keeping going, keeping implementing the changes, and then kind of reevaluating at the end of that 12 months. But ongoing audit can really see where the differences might be made. So for instance, once I had a service user come in to talk about their implants, my audits improved dramatically. So that had a huge impact, meeting somebody who was using an implant. So you can kind of see how different interventions can affect your referrals as well.
And that's important, isn't it? Making sure that the intervention that you put in actually is working, and if it's not, then you need to change it. So that's what we're sort of hoping to try.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I thought it was interesting what you said about the AB clinics, that you're going to use them for the borderline cases. That's a really good way to use them, because often adults who've got profound hearing loss, they will score less than 50%. They definitely will be within that range. So actually that test isn't necessary. It's an additional test that isn't necessary before referral, especially during this period where we don't want particularly to bring patients in unnecessarily. But actually borderline patients, ski slope losses, people that are hovering up the 80 dBHL line, they're the ones that actually it's really important to check what their speech score is like.
Yeah, and then for those patients who said, oh, well, actually my hearing aids are fine, I'm getting on fine, we at the moment don't really have much of a way of proving that, and actually, are they getting on fine, or are they just sort of coping because that's all they know, and it's just proving that to them, and using it as a counselling tool as well, and giving sort of people a chance to see, you know, how they're getting on or how they're not.
Yeah, so, definitely. People can get on very well with the wrong technology that isn't suitable. You know, they're not picking up much speech, they're getting on for other reasons. It's still our responsibility to explore that, isn't it? And so if they have got the wrong technology, to sort of offer them the right technology. Great, that's lovely. Yeah. We've had quite a few questions about extracting the data from the different database systems. So there's audit-based as PN, audit-based as crystal reports. A lot of you will use crystal reports anyway. They can be done by PTA, I think they can be done by age, by even maybe device that the person's using. Cochlear have developed a report that you can speak to them about. Their report extracts the data and then it categorises the patients for you, so it's obviously a much quicker way to do it. There is a report in PN that we have that we can share with you. In fact, the instructions for the report are now in the handout. You can download it straight from this webinar, and we'll send out the actual file for PN separately that you can upload into PN. That will extract patients by their audiogram. and you can put age in there as well. And then you then have to search through them manually to assign them to a category. It can be time consuming. That's why I said you don't have to do the whole 12 months. You might decide to do a month of that and just see what the referral pattern is like in your service. And then you can keep checking and re-auditing to see how that referral pattern changes. I think the take-home message here is that any type of audit is better than no audit. Currently, this isn't something that we tend to monitor or audit or evaluate at all, and that any audit you do will be able to link into the initiatives that you provide, and you'll be able to discuss it with your team and really identify that maybe there is a problem that people weren't aware that was there. People kind of assume, yeah, we're talking about implants, we're referring people for implants, and actually the audits can give you a really clear picture of whether that is happening or not. So we've got time now. We kind of scheduled in a short comfort break, which we will take. I know it's early on in the webinar, but I think it's useful just for people just to have 10 minutes. And we will join again at 10 o'clock, and that's where we're going to start talking through case studies. Unai and Lenore are both going to talk about case studies, and we're going to talk about what's going to come next. So the next lot of training after this will be the BCIG conference, which is in March 2021. It's an online conference, entirely online, but we do have a breakout room that we can use for the champions, for us. So we need to plan what we're going to deliver in that breakout room. There's a survey that's going out based on what we talked about today, but also what you want us to do next. What do you want to see in the training? How could we support you more? So your feedback on that's really important as well. So that will be shared at some point. Hello, so we're ready to make a start again now. Okay, Unai? Super.
Hello, so my name is Unai Martinez-Estivariz. I'm the Adult Auditory Implant Coordinator at the Manchester Implant Centre, and I'm also a BCIG trustee, and we've got Lenore Jones with us today. Hi, Lenore.
Hi, hi, my name's Lenore. I work for the North Wales Auditory Implant Service.
Okay, so there were a few questions in the break, and there's quite a few looking at them. We can try and answer some of them now, whatever the ones that are relevant, but we might have to get back to you offline about some of the questions in here. So let me just go through them. There was one question about performing AB words tests in a free field condition, and whether that would be useful. And yes, definitely, that would be very useful. As a matter of fact, that's how we perform those tests when we do a CA assessment. So if the speakers are calibrated to the right level, obviously it's difficult to have calibration for free field tests, but if they are, that would be a really good tool to have on a screen for patients that could be candidates. And there was another question about at what stage should this discussion about cochlear implants be introduced. I'm just reading the question. I only ask because the criteria states candidates must have bilateral profound deafness and insufficient benefit from hearing aids. Therefore, hearing aids must be fitted first. Is that right? That's correct. So we want all candidates to try hearing aid amplification before they're referred for a cochlear implant. The reason for that is that there will be a few of them that are potentially out of criteria because they derive enough function from the hearing aid. So the NICE guideline does state that every candidate should try hearing aids first. So the discussion could be introduced later on at following the fitting at follow-ups or reassessments. Right, there's a few more questions, but we'll have to get back to those offline, and we'll just carry on with the case studies. So just before we do that, just a quick reminder of the criteria. Everybody should be familiar with this. You can see what used to be the old criteria in red. This is the audiometric criteria. And then when patients are sent for an assessment for a cochlear implant, then we can also do some functional testing. So it used to be that we did BKB sentences where the criteria was set at 50%. Or less, and now, as you can see, the audiometric criteria has expanded quite significantly, and it requires a bilateral severe to profound hearing loss with thresholds at 80 dB or worse at any two frequencies between 500 and 4,000. So that would be 500, 1K, 2K, 3K as well, and 4K. So only two of those need to be in criteria for a patient to be referred for a cochlear implant. And the functional criteria has changed as well. We use now AB words, which is a slightly different test. It's a little bit tricky in some ways, and that together with the relaxation of the audiometric criteria means that the whole criteria has been relaxed quite significantly. So we're going to present a few case studies, and Lenore and I will happily answer any questions. But the idea is that we'll present the case study with some information about the patient's hearing, an audiogram, and then we'll launch a poll. We would like all of you to vote and tell us whether you would normally refer that patient if you saw them in clinic, whether you wouldn't refer them, or whether you're not quite sure about what you should be doing. And then we can see the results. That will give us a little bit of information about what to talk about, start the questions, and we'll try and go through them as we go. But before we launch into the cases, we're just making some assumptions. We're assuming that all candidates that we're going to present today have had their hearing aids or any hearing device they use optimized. They're all motivated to go through this process, and they're well informed, so they know a little bit of information about how cochlear implants work. So without further ado, we're just going to talk about the first case. So the first case is an elderly adult, and they have an acquired loss, and they've used hearing aids for many years. Their speech production is normal. Their main mode of communication is oral, and their health is not at its best. They are a wheelchair user, and on top of that, they've got a heart condition, so they're unable to undergo a general anesthetic. So you can see the PTA in there, which, looking at the points that we talked about before, it meets the latest criteria. So if we could, Victoria, please, if we could launch the poll for this case, we can. Brilliant, thank you. So if you could all just have a think and just vote on this case, see whether you think you would refer this patient for an assessment, whether you wouldn't, or whether you're not sure. We'll just give it a few minutes. Okay, I think we can close the poll. Thank you. So, oh, there we go. So those are the results. So 53% would refer, 18 wouldn't, and about 30%, so 1 in 3 nearly not sure. Okay, let's check the questions. That's an audit question. So the idea of this case study was to remind everybody that although historically cochlear implant surgeries have been done under general anesthetic, there are options to consider surgeries under local anesthetic. So as long as they meet the criteria and they're happy to have an assessment and be considered, they will need a very likely anesthetic opinion. But as long as they meet the criteria, these are the kind of patients that we would like to assess and see whether they could benefit from a cochlear implant. Would you like to add anything else to that, Lenore?
No, I would agree. I think more and more centres now are able to do surgeries under local anaesthetic. So although it does obviously impact some aspects of the surgery, then it shouldn't affect your decision to refer them on for an assessment. Because, as you know, by referring them for an assessment, it doesn't mean they're definitely going to have an implant. It's a case of getting the discussion going, and they should really have access to the potential to have this as a treatment option.
Yes, I think one of the recurrent themes that we'll find is that it's important to have that relationship with your mentor and ask about whether your centre offers different interventions. So this would be just another one. So you might be worth getting in touch and say, does your centre offer any surgeries under local anaesthetics, and just move the conversation onwards from there. But I think it's good to mention this to patients that is an option. It doesn't have to be a general anaesthetic, which can carry a different type of risks depending on what sort of conditions, medical conditions, the candidate has.
Yeah, Jill's just asked about whether children would be considered for local anaesthetic. So I don't work in a paediatric service, so I can't answer that. I'm not sure if you know, Unai.
I don't work with the paediatric service either. I can't think of any cases lately, but we can get back to you on that.
Yeah.
Okay. So next case is again an adult. The whole focus of this refresher is adult, so that will be all the cases really. So this is sudden sensorineural hearing loss. They've tried hearing aids, but to no avail. They've got normal speech, they're oral, and there was a query when they were hospitalized that they may have suffered meningitis. And as you can see on the PTA, there is no recordable thresholds bilaterally. So Victoria, could we launch the poll for this, please? Thank you. Okay, we can close the poll. Thank you. Okay, so 87% say yes, and then very small number, 7% no, 7% I don't know. So this is a case of a sudden hearing loss, somebody who's had some form of viral or bacterial event, and they've lost all their hearing. This is a candidate that we would probably want to fast track. The main reason being certain types of meningitis can cause some ossification in cochlea, and therefore it's important to try and fast track them. So we would try and arrange scanning as soon as possible and potentially fast track them through our surgery release to try and provide them with a cochlear implant before the cochlear ossify, because once the cochlear ossify, it can be very tricky to insert the array into the cochlea, and therefore it can also limit the outcomes. So if this is the kind of presentation that you come across, do send it to us as soon as possible. You can email us, you don't have to send it on the post, you can ring us, and you can just talk through us to the story, and we'll do our best to try and fast track them.
Yeah, I'd say definitely contact your local centre with any of these cases as soon as possible, like Unai said. I know in our centre we quite often would get these patients even before they've tried hearing aids, because we can fit them locally in our centre. The centres are different, so I would definitely just pick up that phone, call your local centre, discuss them as soon as you come across them, really.
Okay, I don't think I can see any questions around this case on here, so we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so this is the third case study, an adult, congenital profound sensorineural hearing loss, and there's been no evidence of the hearing changing since birth, so very profound hearing loss. They've never used hearing aids, at least not consistently, and they haven't got any speech, and on top of that, they don't use the voice at all during the across their everyday life. The main mode of communication is VSL, and they had some genetic testing that revealed an X-linked syndrome. So before we launch the poll, it's quite important to know that this is just referral criteria. We're not thinking about patients that will definitely have a cochlear implant. These are the patients that we want to assess. So with that in mind, would you refer, would you not, or not sure? Okay, we can close the poll, thank you. There we go. So about half of you say they would refer, a quarter no, and a quarter not sure. Okay, Lina, would you like to start with this one?
Yeah, this kind of case is always a difficult case, and I think it splits even implant centres sometimes as well. It's a very difficult one. I think if they're primarily BSL and not using any voice, then it is very unlikely that they will benefit from having a cochlear implant in terms of any more benefits than they would have from hearing aids if they were to try hearing aids. It's a slightly different story if they've been aided, if they've had hearing aids in the past, and if they have developed some kind of vocal speech, then that definitely tips the balance, and I would say those ones you would want to refer. But if they haven't been aided, if they haven't developed any speech and are not using their voice proactively, then it's very, very unlikely that they will benefit from a cochlear implant.
Yes, I'm in agreement, Lenore. I think you're right in saying that there's some differences across centres and CI centres in terms of offering implants for this kind of candidate. I know that at least in Manchester, we've not often considered cases like this because the evidence behind the benefits that these candidates tend to get are often not measurable, and often it's quite difficult to predict whether they're going to become non-users or not, which can complicate things. But ultimately, this is again the kind of question that as a champion, it would be best if you got in touch with your mentor and present this case to them and say, is this the kind of candidate that you want us to send for an assessment? Because every centre will have a different preference and a different way of assessing these kind of candidates. Yeah,
we've got a question on this one, which is, would the CI assessment not be done in view of sound awareness rather than a full benefit? And I mean, if they were to be referred, then obviously we would assess them in the same way as anyone else. And in most congenital cases, especially when they've got very little speech development, the main benefit of an implant for them is sound awareness. But in this case, they've never been aided, so that the auditory nerve, the connections haven't been established, or that's what we're assuming in this case. So there's no real evidence that the implant would even give them appropriate sound awareness even. It would be very, they would probably not like it, and they would probably end up being a non-user. So even in that case, this sort of patient with no development of voice, no previous aided hearing, will probably not even get sound awareness in this case. Would you agree, Unai?
I completely, I would, yes. And I think if anybody was, one of these candidates was very insistent on having a cochlear implant, we would have to evaluate the motivation and their expectations very carefully, because as Lenore said, it's difficult to guarantee an outcome with a cochlear implant anyway, but in this case, it's given that their auditory nerve has been deprived from sound pretty much from birth. It's very difficult to be able to guarantee any kind of outcome out of that. So in a way, we like to think about cochlear implants as something that can bring back hearing that you've had. So if you've never had any kind of sound awareness, any kind of hearing, open set discrimination, closed set discrimination, a cochlear implant is very unlikely to be able to bring that back. And that's why the outcomes tend to be very affected by duration of deafness. So we know that somebody who's been deaf for, say, 6 months because they've had meningitis, as long as the cochlea is not ossified, they'll probably do quite well with the cochlear implant, other than adapting to the new change from going from normal hearing to a profound loss. But somebody who's had a profound hearing loss for over 20 years, 30 years, we know that the outcomes are going to be very limited. So if you're born with a profound loss and they've never had access to that kind of sound, a cochlear implant, unfortunately, is not going to be able to provide any meaningful benefit.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think the main thing here is the fact they've not been aided, they've not developed any speech. If they have been aided, they have developed some sort of speech, then those would be suitable in that case for assessment.
Okay, case study 4, adults again acquire progressive severe to profound hearing loss. They've used their hearing aids for the last 20 years as the hearing has deteriorated. They've got normal speech production, they're oral, and the difference with this patient is that he's registered blind in both eyes. And you can see the PTA in there. Can we please launch the poll, Victoria? Thank you. Okay, I think we can close it now. 91% yes, and 9% I don't know. Okay. So the yes, they obviously meet the criteria in both years. On top of that, they're registered blind, so they can rely on lip reading. I think the important point to make in here would be that because they're registered blind, they are potentially eligible for not just one cochlear implant, but bilateral cochlear implants. And this is up to the patient really. So when we do the assessments, most patients that are registered blind tend to go for bilateral cochlear implants. But some of them decide to just go for one. They still want to keep the hearing aid on the other side, and they get some benefits from bimodal stimulation. But that's a conversation to be had with these patients, that they would be eligible for two if they wanted to. Anything else to add, Lenore?
No, I agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so case 5. I'm just checking the questions, so there was no questions there.
No.
There was a question about developing a HTS for cochlear implants. Is that available if we're in a hospital that provides cochlear implants, or can we do that training externally? I don't think that's been completely agreed yet. My understanding is that it's going to be an online module, so I would assume that you can do that externally, but I think BAA will probably be able to provide more information about that. There was a question from Fiona as well, the representative from Medell, about would you fast track a visually impaired candidate? Potentially, it depends on everybody's situation. There is no agreement on fast tracking other than the ones that are very sudden hearing losses. But every case is done on an ad hoc case-by-case basis. So if this person was struggling considerably because the hearing loss has been rather rapid or sudden, yes, we would consider fast tracking them. If they've had hearing aids and the hearing loss has been rather progressive, probably not. But again, we will assess that on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so next case is 5, case 35, congenital profound sensorineural hearing loss with a family history of hearing loss. They've had hearing aids since they were diagnosed at age 1. They use the hearing aid, they're a good hearing aid user. They've got a deaf intonation, but it's intelligible to familiar speakers. They can both communicate in BSL and orally. And this person competes for the Deaf Olympics. Can we please launch the poll? Thank you. Okay, thank you. 88% yes, 10% don't know, 2% no. Right, so this is the case that Lenore was alluding to earlier. It's a very similar case to the one we've seen before. So basically born with a profound hearing loss, but the key difference here is that they've been aided. So that auditory nerve, although limited, has had some stimulation and has kept that auditory nerve active, stimulated. So this is a case that I would imagine if the patient is motivated and they know there are limitations, we wouldn't expect this patient to derive the same benefit as somebody with an acquired loss over a few years, but they could well be a candidate for a cochlear implant as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Unai, and exactly what we were saying about the other case, really, isn't it? This is kind of the flip side of the coin, and we certainly do go on to implant these cases, so these are definitely ones that we would be happy to accept. There has been a question posted about the last congenital case as well that we missed, I think. It was about whether the assessment process for case number 3 would help the patient even if they didn't end up having an implant. So I think every kind of centre is different on whether they would still see the patient for an assessment. At North Wales we would, and we would then kind of follow that up. If it was a no decision, we'd follow that up with recommendations on kind of advice on help with communication, daily communication, tactics, obviously, any hearing aid kind of suggestions or anything we can help that way. So in terms of support, we would still kind of give them that as a treatment following on from that assessment. But every centre is different, so maybe something to discuss with your mentor again.
Yes, I'm in agreement as well. I think what's important to counsel the patient on that discussion is the fact that they're not a very clear candidate, and therefore there's a chance they might not be offered a cochlear implant, even more so than a traditional candidate that you would refer. So it's almost prepping them about possible outcomes in a different way. Okay, so next case is number 6, adult unknown progressive skiers lobe sensorineural hearing loss. They struggle to benefit from hearing aids or even wear them full time. Their speech production shows some errors due to very limited high frequency access. They're oral and the hearing is very much improved when they can lip read. And some that region 10 testing has revealed that regions from 1.5 kilohertz onwards. So you can see the PTA on your left, and that's the poll. Oh, that poll came on and went very quickly. Can we launch that again, please, Victoria? Thank you. Oh, the results.
Sorry, I'm not going to be able to put that one up, Unai.
Oh, okay, that's okay. Well, we'll just talk through this one then. Leonor, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, so I think these sort of cases have definitely come up to centres with the introduction of the new criteria, and these are the sort of patients that would definitely be fitting into that kind of new bracket of criteria. So certainly these are ones we would definitely welcome for assessment. So I think the things to look out for is clues in, in areas that they're struggling. So hearing on the phone, hearing in the car, hearing in noise. Even if they appear to be doing quite well one-to-one, if they're struggling in other situations, then they may well be better off with a cochlear implant than a hearing aid. So these are definitely ones that we'd be happy to assess. If you can do AB words in-house in your clinic before even sending them to us, that will help greatly as well. But if you can't, don't worry, just pass them through. And yeah, these ski slopes losses, we are seeing more and more of these coming through and benefiting from an implant.
Yes, I think something interesting with these cases is that, as you would expect, they can probably hear male voices better than female voices, and just obviously that's completely dependent on the configuration of the hearing loss. And so when we see them in clinics, and centers are now doing both male and female testing in an attempt to make it a little bit more ecologically valid when we test for these patients, because if you test them using the test that we historically use, which is a male voice, there's an argument to say that these candidates have been penalized because they have a very good hearing on the low frequencies. Something else to mention is that these are probably good candidates for electroacoustic stimulation, which is a combined device. It's a hybrid device, which is basically a cochlear implant and a hearing aid within one. And that can be said. It's very dependent on the preservation of hearing that happens in the ear that is implanted. But if the preservation of hearing is optimal, that's something that can be considered, and it tends to drive the outcomes a little bit higher while the hearing is preserved. But the only other thing that I wanted to mention on this case is that if the high frequency loss has been there for many years, it's the kind of case that will require possibly extra rehabilitation post-op, because those high frequencies have not been stimulated for a long time, and a lot of patients tend to struggle adapting to these extra high frequency stimulation on the basal end of the cochlea. So that's something that, again, you can counsel about, we can counsel about, and we can help patients through that.
There's just a question on this one, Unai, just talking about the EAS side of things. If anyone has a progressive loss, how long will we wait to decide whether to go for an EAS or purely electric stimulation? So, yeah, I don't know if you want to answer that one.
Yeah, I can do. So I think, again, every center might use a different approach. I could talk about Manchester. So in Manchester, we tend to consider EAS devices for anybody whose thresholds at 500 are 65 or better. I mean, this is a very severe case, severe skiers loss, hearing loss. You can see at 500 they've got essentially normal hearing. So this would be a very good EAS candidate. Anything below 80 decibels at 500, we're not thinking about an EAS candidate. But again, it's all depending on the hearing preservation side of things. So even if somebody has that level of hearing now, normal 15 at 500, if for whatever reason the hearing is not preserved, unfortunately, there wouldn't be EAS candidates, and we will only find that out after surgery. But hearing preservation has improved quite significantly in the last few years with soft surgery techniques, and an EAS is just part of that.
Yeah, and we would be the same in North Wales as well. So the same sort of level, 60 decibels or better. If their hearing progresses, if their hearing deteriorates after surgery, then in most cases it's simply a case of removing that acoustic device from the EAS and then going straight in for full electric stimulation. So it's not a problem at all. It's something that we can do quite quickly in clinic. Let's just remove that acoustic component from the fitting.
There's a question about tinnitus. Patients with severe tinnitus, they're worried about what might happen. How do you counsel these people? So it's difficult. It's a difficult part to counsel because as part of surgery, tinnitus could improve, tinnitus could get worse, or tinnitus could remain unchanged. So again, it's not a guarantee. I think it's important that the expectations are realistic in the sense that it could change. And more often than not, the case is that once the implant is activated, as often happens with hearing aids, patients with a cochlear implant are less aware of the tinnitus. But there are cases where the tinnitus can be exacerbated by the implant, and in which cases we would use the same techniques that we use with hearing aids, really, in terms of counselling and hearing therapy.
Yeah, and there's just a couple of questions about sound recover and the fact that using that, will it affect kind of referral for CI and so on. So I think sound recover obviously is a good thing to try with these patients in terms of the hearing aid side of things, but it shouldn't affect your decision to send these patients on for referral. It doesn't affect how we kind of see them, really. Sound recovery is just one aspect of the aiding. It can improve their speech perception, that's true, but basically if they're in criteria on the speech testing and the patient's motivated and wants to go ahead with an implant, then they would go ahead and have an implant. So it doesn't really affect how we assess them at all. And you know, if sound recover works for them and then means that their speech test scores are too good, then that's fine. They can keep without hearing aid, but it doesn't generally affect how we assess them in that way.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add in there is that yes, sound recover or any frequency transposition type of technology can help, but at the end of the day, it's just a workaround, isn't it? So ultimately, we're not able to stimulate those high frequencies so that the person can get the pure clarity from it. So do not delay. I wouldn't delay a referral just because you're trying that. Definitely try, given different programs to try, see which one they prefer. And once we assess them, we can just get a better picture of how they're functioning.
Yeah, I would even go as far as saying if you're activating sound recover for a patient, then that's a sign that they may need an implant referral.
I'm just looking at the next questions. There's another one about sound recover. I think we've We've covered that.
Yeah.
We only have male AV word testing. Can we make the referral if AV score is better than 50%, but write this in the report that we expect scores to be worse than female voice? Yes, I would say so. Yes, that means that you've done some speech testing. If they score around 50% on the male voice, it's very likely they will score less than that on the female voice. So as long as we've got some extra information about how they're functioning, that's brilliant, and that helps us a lot. And even if they score 70% on a male AV word test, they could still be quite borderline on a female test. So I think from a Manchester perspective, we would welcome a referral like that.
Yeah, would agree as well.
Okay, moving on. Case 7. Adult congenital history of chronic suppurative otitis media and previous grommet surgery. They've been aided well but unable to wear aids full time due to recurring infections. They tend to alternate ears with the hearing aids to try and manage that. Speech production is normal, the oral, and they've tried some form of bone conduction hearing device on a headband, but they found no benefit over the hearing aids. Hold, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you. 65% yes, 13% no, 22% I don't know. Okay. Would you like to start with this one, Linar?
Yes, so these cases, I think a lot of people are not sure what to do with them. So they're probably very borderline for a bone anchored hearing aid, and the decision then is what you do with them, really. The answer for me would be yes, send them our way for assessment. There are certain things that we would be looking out for in terms of infections. If they were meeting the implant criteria, and if we were to carry on with going down that route, in some circumstances, if their infections were really, really bad, then they may require 2-stage surgery for an implant. So the first stage would be mastoid obliteration to prepare the ear for accepting the implants, just to make sure that it's kind of infection proof. Because if you have a cochlear implant, the last thing you want is an infection, as you can lose that implant that way. So there possibly would be 2 stages of implants in this case. But the other thing to consider is that some implant centres or auditory implant centres do offer other types of implants as well, which these sort of patients would be considered suitable for.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about the 2-stage surgery. You know, I think it's becoming more and more regular in terms of ears that are very recurrent for infections, and it's very important to safeguard the implant from future infections that way. I think historically we've almost understood cochlear implants as purely for sensorineural hearing losses, and therefore anything that is mixed we've tended not to refer. And I think it's important to realize that if a bone conduction hearing device might not work, although it can be tried, and as we know, said, many centers do both type of implants, it's worth thinking about referring this patient. Looking at the audiogram, this is the kind of patient that, given that the thresholds are quite borderline, that's the AC thresholds, I think it would be worth considering doing some speech testing if you can, because this kind of hearing loss with a conductive element to it, if they're well aided, they can do quite well with hearing aids, and often they will be out of criteria functionally. So if you do an AV word test and they score 95% with their hearing aids, there's an argument to say that we can improve that with a cochlear implant. I think the tricky one on this case is the fact that because they get so many infections, they can wear the hearing aids, and therefore in some cases, if the situation is such that they just can't wear it, really their optimal aided situation is to be unaided, really, rather than wearing hearing aids, because the ear can take it. So in those cases, we can consider a cochlear implant, so that we can keep that ear free of an ear mold potentially. Okay, right, so next case study number 8. So this is an adult, and they've got essentially a dead ear on the right side due to Meniere's disease. And oops, sorry about that, just going back to the case study. And they've got mild to moderate hearing loss on the left ear. They were given a BAA on the right side, and they've not gained a lot of benefit from it. The speech production is normal, the oral, and they score 100% on BKB testing and 94% on AB words at 70 decibels. Can we launch the poll, please? Okay, thank you. So that seems like a clear-cut one. You wouldn't refer, and yes, essentially, going back to the criteria, we want the NICE guidance states that they need to have a bilateral severe to profound hearing loss. So cases such as single-sided deafness or largely asymmetrical hearing losses, where the good ear is significantly out of criteria, are not cases that, unfortunately, we can consider for a cochlear implant. So some of these cases might potentially be declined for an assessment. Anything else to add, Lenore?
Yeah, no, these cases are difficult, but unfortunately the speech test scores are much too good to be considered for a cochlear implant.
Again, just speak to your mentors. Sometimes, very rarely, there's some companies sponsor studies that they're looking at a specific type of hearing loss. So I know in the past companies have funded SSD studies for single-sided deafness just to look at outcomes of these cases. And so if you come across a case like that, the patient is quite insistent that they would like an assessment, you can always get in touch with your mentor and say, will you let me know if there is any studies that are looking into these candidates? I'm aware of the knowing criteria, but just giving the look for these kind of cases. We've just got a comment on case study 8 is good for a Bicross system. Yes, correct. I think this case study was sent from our the champions last week. I failed to mention that at the beginning. Thank you to all the champions that have sent case studies. These are all basically the ones sent after the BCIG conference. So we've just put them together and appreciate that. I think that's a good point about the Bicross. I think it's ultimately where they were trying to do with the BAA on the right, really. And that's kind of a fancy Bicross that they have on that side. And they might find some benefit from a Bicross hearing aid. That's something that can be considered, yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, case study 9, adult. Query NF2, any retrocochlear pathologies. They struggle to wear hearing aids. They don't find them of benefit. The speech production is normal. They're oral, but you can tell that they're very reliant on lip reading when they're in clinic. They've got OAEs at all frequencies tested, but nevertheless, the cortical testing has shown a profound loss. On a speech testing, they get about 50% when they can lip read on a BKB. And they get 0%, no score, when they can lip read. Can we please launch the poll? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think it's, oh, are we back on? Yes, I think we are, yes. This is a tricky case. So we're thinking about, when we think about a cochlear implant referral, first of all, we look at the PTA and we see whether that meets the criteria, but often some candidates or some patients will not meet the PTA criteria, but function in their everyday life as somebody who would be in criteria. So it's quite difficult to assess that. And there we come across some true cases of neuropathy. And the question about these cases is, at what point in the hearing pathway that neuropathy it's happening. So whether it's a cochlear neuropathy or it's more of a central processing disorder. And there's no standard gold standard for testing these kind of processing disorders. So it's quite difficult to get to the bottom of that. But ultimately, when you see a patient in clinic, if they are aided with the information that you have, and as far as you know, they're optimized, if they function as somebody who would be in cochlear implant criteria, I think that's a red flag to think about potentially referring on those grounds. But they're very complex cases, and often means that we have to do a significant number of tests before we can proceed and just try them with hearing aids set in a different way. But that's what I would say. Just try and see the patient on how they function rather than how they present on a PTA.
Yeah, I would agree. I think in this case, in some ways, you kind of ignore the PTA, which is against everything that audiologists do. But in this case, the patient is presenting in a way that's not kind of compatible with the presenting PTA. Certainly in our centre, we would assess these patients and we would do kind of all the diagnostic tests that we can do. As soon as I said, it is a difficult decision and whether these patients, you know, go ahead for an implant or not. And I can't really say we can answer that definitely if they would have an implant or not. It would depend on a lot of factors. In terms of funding, we'd have to apply for special funding for these cases as well, as they do not fit into the audiological criteria from their PTA. But they certainly would be assessed, and I think you know, in this case, especially given the history here, they're really struggling with the hearing aids in day-to-day life, so they certainly need to access any potential treatment options available for them, which a CI may be suitable for. I think someone's asked about possibly ABI referral, so it's worth probably just noting that there's some implant centres do accept referrals for auditory brainstem implants, Manchester being one of them. So yeah, that's something that can be considered at times as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the ABI, especially because we put NF2 in there. So normally patients that are diagnosed with with fibromatosis 2, they're usually under an NF2 team, and therefore they're under fairly regular tests to just check how the hearing changes, because they could well go from normal hearing very rapidly to a profound loss. So whenever we do a CA assessment, whether the implant does ABIs or not, they will consider them, and they will then refer onward to a center that does do ABRs. So again, don't stop that from referring, even though it's not a CI candidate, still refer it to a CA center. They can do the full assessment and then decide whether it's more of an ABI or a CI type of candidate. Okay.
Yeah.
There's one more question on this case. If you didn't have corticals but did have OE, would you still proceed to implant? So no corticals, and we would have OEs. So it would depend on the case, really. We'd have to look at the scans, see if there is any reasons for why the processing is so bad. So whether there is any retrocochlear pathology, whether there is any acoustic neuroma, any NF2 like this case. But yes, as Lenore said, we would have to apply for funding separately, which can be tricky, and it can be quite difficult to evidence to commissioners that we can implant these cases. So this is definitely something that needs to be checked with your mentors and see if they've got a system in place to put cases through to panel for this. Okay, moving on. Case number 10, adult. They lost their hearing due to rubella when they were born. The left ear has never been aided and is being profound since birth. And the right ear has been aided since age 3, and it has recently deteriorated a little bit further. They've got a very slight deaf intonation. They're mainly oral, and they've applied to have a hearing dog, which they've had for the last 3 years. Paul, please. Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah, good. So very clear pattern there. I think most people would refer. The interesting bit of this case would be the ear to implant. So often we receive referrals and patients, rightly so, they might expect that they would have, in this case, the left ear implanted because they can wear a hearing aid on the right side and they get some benefit from it. And they don't want to compromise their residual hearing post-operatively. The important thing to maybe have a conversation with the patient before referring in such cases where the asymmetry is so significant from birth is the fact that they might not be recommended an implant on the worst ear. At times, unfortunately, the only ear that we would consider is the better ear, is the only ear with residual hearing. And it's a conversation to be had with the patient to see whether that's something that they would consider. They can still come to the assessment. We can have that chat in more detail with them. But again, it gives them more time to think about that option and to prepare themselves for that.
Yeah, definitely the right answer to send them for assessment. And as Una said, it'll be a kind of discussion about ear choice, really. That would probably be the deal breaker, I suppose, for this patient. But you know, I think the majority of the patients that we come across in this situation, they do mostly go on to have an implant and do very well. So it's a discussion that we'd have as part of the assessment.
Yeah, I think this can be tricky for implant centers in terms of recommending implants. This is a very extreme example where the left ear, unfortunately, would never be a candidate for a cochlear implant. But you may come across cases where they had stopped using a hearing aid on the worst ear for the last 10 years, for example, and they've got better hearing on the right side. And in those cases, it's trying to assess what sort of level of hearing, what sort of progression of hearing loss they've had, whether they were aided. So when you do a referral for a cochlear implant, very, very useful to include as many previous PTAs as you can. Because if we can see that somebody's left ear has been unaided for, let's say, 10 years, but 10 years ago they had reasonably good hearing and they were aided and they were getting some benefit from it, we may consider an implant on that side. We may even put it to the patient. We might say, look, this is, both ears are candidates. The left ear has not been aided for 10 years, so the benefit might be limited. The right ear, you've got more hearing, more to lose, but you might do better with that. So it could well be that it's a patient choice in regards to which ear to implant. Okay, right, last case study. So unknown acquired hearing loss. They were fitted about 5 years ago with hearing aids for the first time. Data logging is showing that they use the hearing aid very little and they tend to reduce the BC quite significantly. Normal speech production, oral. They do have OAs, they've got reflex at all frequencies, and they appear to communicate very well without lip reading. So the PTA and their functional presentation doesn't quite match. Paul, please. Thank you. 65% no, 27% yes, 8% I don't know. Okay. Would you like to start with this one, Lenore?
Yeah. So this question, the question for the poll on this one is quite an interesting one because it's would you refer? And I think the straight answer is based on the PTA, yes, you would refer, and that's the right decision. But obviously, as Unai said, there are things that don't match up in this case. From our point of view, in our CI centre in North Wales, we would accept this referral, but we would be proceeding to do diagnostic assessments because there is a very great variation between their PTA test and the way they do functionally. So we probably wouldn't be going on to implant them based on an assumption from what you've written in this case study, but we can do further diagnostic assessment to to kind of get a grip on their kind of organic thresholds, really. Not every CI centre possibly would be doing that. Everyone's different, but again, speak to your mentor about that. But certainly, you know, if you're stuck with these sort of cases, not sure what to do with them, the PTA, you know, would suggest implant referral criteria, but on reflection from reading into it a bit more, then probably not. But we would do the diagnostic assessment and reach that decision as a CI team for this one, in our case.
Yes, I think the point of this case study was to highlight a fairly common occurrence in clinic, which is non-organic hearing loss, or at least an overlay. I think what's important to note is that as clinicians, we have experience of discussing and having that interaction with cases that are severe to profound and how they function. So it's important that we try and match the puzzle in a way. And so if you have any concerns about their communication in clinic and not matching the PTA, I think it's worth definitely alerting the implant team when you refer them. I think most implant teams will consider some form of objective testing, and they might not do it for every candidate, but they will do it on an ad hoc basis if there are any concerns, any mismatches. So that's just giving the heads up, really, because in some cases we might be able to plan to do the objective assessment on the day of the initial assessment. So it's good to get the heads up on that. And also just send us information about data logging if you think it's relevant, that could add information to this case, and how they any other medical issues that they might have. Is not unusual for non-organic patients to have interaction with other medical services, so we might have to get in touch with them as well. A very common one is visual loss as well, so dual sensory loss, where there are queries about organicity from both ends. So just provide as much information, and again, get in touch with your mentor and ask whether that's something that they can consider. Some implant centers will write a report back and say, we've done some objective testing and we've found that this person's hearing loss is rather moderate rather than profound, and therefore they would benefit from a revision of the hearing aid amplification. So I think it's good to build those links to try and just provide what's best for this patient, and also maybe think about the clinical psychology side of things for these cases, whether you can do that locally, or whether the implant center can provide things like that. But again, that's a discussion to be had with each implant center.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think with any referral you send our way, the more information the better. So please, you know, include journal entries, histories, PTAs, anything you've got. I think all implant centers would agree. The more information we have on every referral, the better, really.
Okay, so that's my section so far. So I'll just pass on to, well, you're here. Julie, you carry on. I'll mute myself now.
Lovely, thank you. So I'm just going to go through a few kind of real life completed case studies. These are all real kind of patients that I've picked for this webinar. So if we go next slide, please. Okay, so this first case study is an example of a sloping sensorineural hearing loss. So this was a 60-year-old male with unknown kind of cause for the hearing loss. He'd had quite a rapid progression of his hearing. So kind of within 5 years, he'd gone from kind of normal hearing to the hearing loss shown on the PTA here. A very good hearing aid user, very motivated to improve his hearing, had purchased loads of wireless accessories, devices to try and get the best sound for him. But in the past kind of three years, he'd been really struggling, not being able to use the phone. He's a very social guy, so kind of keen cyclist, used to go out cycling quite a lot, but has had to stop all of this really. And it also stopped kind of socializing. So these are all the sort of things that we see quite often when we assess patients. They're kind of changing their lifestyle because of the limitations of their hearing. But despite this, he wanted to improve his hearing as much as possible. His main goals was to improve communication with his 14-year-old son, because he felt he was not interacting with him very well due to the hearing loss. So you can see there the pre-op speech test scores, and he scored 22% with both hearing aids in with a male voice, and as we talked previously, these tend to have patients with a high frequency hearing loss. They don't tend to do as well with a female, so this patient actually couldn't hear the female voice at all, and then the AB word scores there at all as well. So this patient fit actually into the old criteria pre-March 2019. So if we go next slide. So the outcome of this was that this gentleman received an implant in April 2019, a left cochlear implant, and then we did the switch on about 3 weeks later, and it was a great switch on. He was able to immediately hear voice, even though it was very robotic, very mechanical. He could hear as without the need to lip read straight away. This doesn't happen every time, but in this case, this is what happened. And then by the 1 week review, he was majorly delighted with the outcome. He was able to interact with his son a lot more. He was a mega music fan, so he loved kind of listening to Pink Floyd and all that sort of music. And he was already kind of streaming music from his phone to his processor by Bluetooth and really enjoying it. It didn't sound nice, he said. It didn't sound the same way at this early stage, but he was very keen on learning to hear music again. And the great thing was he actually had been on a 100-mile bike ride in the first week with his friends and was able to hear his fellow cyclists around him, which he was delighted. And as you can see there with the speech scores, immediately just after 1 week how high they've gone. So going, especially with a female voice, going from 0% to 88% in 1 week. So, you know, substantial improvement straight away. And then this gentleman's carried on improving within the first year. He's now able to hear on the phone. We saw him for a 12-month review, delayed due to COVID not so long ago, and he's extremely happy with the outcome. Reports for it to have changed his life. So, I mean, for this gentleman, you know, in one-to-one situations, she did manage even before the implant, but it's more than that. It was about his lifestyle, his social circle, the way he interacts with people. And as you can see, his speech scores are very, very, very good. And from the PTA there, you can see the aided thresholds, the blue squares there is what he can hear with his left cochlear implant. So we'll go on to the second case study. There you go. So this case study, again, a sloping sensorineural hearing loss, but this one fits into the new criteria. So this lady had actually been known to us in the cochlear implant team for about 5 years. She was kind of coming back to us every year for a review, but with the old criteria, she was outside of the criteria, but kind of struggling. Again, with this kind of presentation, she was managing well one-to-one, but struggling a lot in noise and kind of heavily reliant on lip reading. And I think her main goal was kind of hearing her family. She couldn't hear in the car, and she was kind of isolating herself more and more. Again, all the signs showing that how the hearing was impacting her. So as you can see on the speech test here, she was slightly out of the old criteria, so scoring more than 50% BKB male, but considering the AB words, the new criteria, which is scoring less than 50% phonemes, she was well within the new criteria. So next slide. Yeah, so this lady went on to have a right cochlear implant in November last year. Initially, we actually fitted this patient with a hybrid device with an EAS, which we mentioned earlier, because her threshold at the time of switch on in her implanted ear and her right ear were within the kind of scope for an electric acoustic device. At switch on, she could hear sounds, but everything was very echoey. She wasn't quite sure about the sound at that early stage. And then we saw her for 1 week review. And again, she was comfortable with the sound, but she herself wasn't sure she was getting much from it. But her family were saying that, you know, she was communicating much better, and she was able to follow conversation in the car even at this early stage. So quite often you find it's the family or it's the people that they're around that notice the benefit first before the patient themselves. So the speech test, again, have gone up considerably in this case. So on the right side, I think previously with the right hearing aid, it was about 26%, gone right up to 62. So that's a massive improvement in a week. And then we've recently seen her for what would have been her 3-month review, unfortunately delayed due to the current situation. But she's doing really well, hearing her husband and daughter well. We did retest the hearing, as you can see from the PTA here, and she has lost that residual hearing she had on the right implanted side. So we have now removed the acoustic component of the hybrid device. So she's now solely on fully electrical stimulation. So it's just a quick kind of change we can do in the programming software. This lady is quite funny. She's quite frustrated though at the lack of opportunities to test the implant out. She really wants to get out there and test her abilities to hear a noise and so on. So she's quite frustrated due to the lockdown situation, but she's doing very, very well. And again, I'm sure she will continue to progress in this way. We'll just go next slide. So the final case study I've got just again reflects the kind of new criteria sort of patients you need to be looking out for. So this is one of the first patients we implanted under the new criteria. 68-year-old female, again a known etiology of hearing loss, but had struggled for hearing loss for about 15 years with a progressive deterioration. Good hearing aid user. As you can see from her PTA, she's got quite an odd configuration really, with one ear being a sloping loss and then the kind of flat loss on the left hand side. Her main problem was kind of using the phone. She really was struggling on the phone. She could just about use it on loudspeaker, but otherwise was really struggling. And again, she was commenting a lot and she was frustrated. She felt isolated. Her social life had reduced dramatically. She was now only socializing with one other couple, whereas before she had a big group of friends that she used to go with. You know, and she just retired, and she found that she wasn't really enjoying her life anymore in terms of the social aspects of her life. And she just appeared very frustrated by that. So as you can see from a speech test there, she was doing very well with that left ear with her left hearing aid. She was scoring 80% on male BKB, which some even of our implant users, you know, don't even reach that kind of score, but just shows that she was getting a lot of auditory input from the left ear. But when we tested her on AB words, she scored just within the new criteria. So we did actually proceed to implant this case. And if we go into next slide. Okay, so this is the outcome in this case. So we proceeded with a right cochlear implant, as that was her worst hearing ear. And we did that in May 2019. I've just noticed I put the wrong dates there for the switch on as well. That's meant to be 2019. But again, very good switch on for this lady. She heard open set speech straight away. And by the 1 week review, she was extremely delighted with the outcome already. She mentioned how much it had changed her life. She'd spoken to her husband on the phone. First time in many, many years, which she was ecstatic about. She was very, very emotionally kind of happy at the 1 week review, but she was just delighted with it really. She was much more confident. You could kind of tell in just the way she came into clinic. She was so much more confident in herself, and immediately started socialising more. I think by the 3-month review, she'd been on a holiday with a gang of her girlfriends and was just much more confident in herself. As you can see there with the speech test scores, they had improved, not as much as a dramatic improvement as the other 2 cases, but I think the thing to remember is outcome is so much more than speech tests in these cases. So how it impacts their life and the benefits they get from a lifestyle point of view can be huge, as well as confidence and so on. And then her 12-month review, again, she's just delighted with things. You know, her main goal now is to hear music better. So music appreciation can be quite limited for some patients with an implant, but if you put the work in and are motivated to improve that, then it can get better. So this is now what we're working on with this patient. But one thing to notice there as well is the speech test scores in noise. Previously, that was a 0% score, but now it's up to 72%, which just shows the impact of how well these patients can do even in difficult situations. So that's the end of the case studies. I don't know if there's any questions there. Can't see any.
There's a couple of questions, Lenore. So somebody's asking, when doing the AB word list, I normally score based on phonemes, not whole words. Should I be scoring on words?
So the criteria is based on the phoneme score, so I wouldn't worry too much about the word score. I think we score both just because we've always done it that way. But yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about kind of a specific word score. Phoneme score is what the criteria is based on.
There's a question about what's the difference between a hybrid and a full implant?
So in terms of the differences, so a hybrid device is a combination device where it's a combination of electric and acoustic stimulation. So acoustic stimulation to the low frequencies up to about 500 Hertz, and then electric stimulation above that. In terms of the difference, in our centre, we do kind of flag these cases and aim to fit with a hybrid device if they've got good low frequency residual hearing, but we don't tend to do anything different in terms of the surgery, because every surgery we do, we employ what we call soft surgery approach, where we try and save any residual hearing that patients may have. So it just depends on when we do a PTA at the switch on stage, if they do have good residual hearing, low frequency hearing in the implanted side, then we will try an EAS device. If they don't, then we'll just go with a full electrical stimulation, so a full implant.
There's no more questions.
Okay, lovely. So I think I'll just finish off with just mention again what Anne-Marie said before. So the plan is to follow up on this webinar and the previous training we did in BCIG 2020 with another training day. That's to be run parallel to the main BCIG conference in 2021. Originally, this conference was to go ahead in Cardiff, but unfortunately due to the circumstances, it's now going to be a virtual online conference. So the dates for the conference are the 11th and 12th of May, slightly later this year. So if you would be interested in attending this day, then please mark those days in your diary. In terms of what we're planning, we're hoping for it to be kind of a parallel session so that attendees can actually attend some of the main conference talks in the BCIG conference, as well as coming into our breakout sessions. So some of the ideas we've got so far, and we'd be very interested to hear from you in the survey after this webinar, what you would like from the next training event. But we're possibly going to have some paediatric focus because we've done mostly adults, well, all adults today. Talk about some borderline case studies, present more audit results from champions and from implant centres. The BAA Service Quality Committee have got a good project going on about data logging in all hearing aid devices, but also in implants. So we'll probably present our findings on that. There's the International Severe and Profound Guidance, which is to be published very soon, so we'll update you on that. And also there's been quite a few questions about kind of bimodal fitting for implant patients. And there is no real guidance on this, but we'd like to kind of do a bit of kind of training and give a bit of advice on this as well. So put that date in the diary and do look out for more information and let us know about anything that you would like us to cover in that day. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Linar. Don, I can't see any. Oh, there is a question. Yes. What is happening with remote adjustments from Cochlear implant centers?
Okay, so I assume that means kind of remote work in general. So yeah, as with every audiology department, CI centres have had to change the way they're working as well. For our centre, we're doing a lot of video consultations, both pre-op and post-op. We're utilising a lot of the remote care packages that the manufacturers have on offer, and we're using the same kind of motto as our local audiology department, in that remote comes first now, really. I don't know, Una, if you've got anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I think other than that, I would say that there are some tools out there that can also allow remote programming of cochlear implants. And this is something that all companies are working on, and it will become a bit more routine. It definitely was useful to have that option as we entered lockdown, and we had a few patients that had just been implanted in the last 2-3 weeks, and with a view to the clinic being closed, we had to switch their implants on a bit earlier than what we would normally have done. But then having those tools was really helpful. So yes, manufacturers are working on that, and there are tools out there that can aid us cochlear implant audiologists to deliver that kind of care. Okay, so I don't think there's any more questions. So we're going to introduce them. One used to be one of my colleagues in the Manchester Royal Infirmary, Shahad House. She's the consumer engagement specialist at Advanced Bionics, and she's going to talk about how they can support all the champions. Thank you, Shahad.
Thank you, Unai. So for those that don't already know me, I'm Shahad and I work for AB. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So before my role at AB, I worked as a clinical scientist in audiology in the NHS for around 12 years, most recently as clinical lead at a regional cochlear implant programme. So I've got quite a good understanding of the clinical challenges that centres face, as well as some of the barriers to referral. So my main role at AB at this time is professional education and raising awareness of cochlear implants to try and break down some of these barriers. So hopefully that's something that I can help you guys with. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, there should be a slide before that one. Lovely, thank you. So in common with other manufacturers, at AB, we're hosting webinars on various topics around cochlear implants. So they're obviously there for you to make use of. We recently launched 3 channels for online video support. So the first is My Listening Child, which is designed for caregivers of children who are aged 0 to 5 years to help increase their language and listening development. The Step into Hearing Success series is designed for teen or adult users of hearing aids or cochlear implants, and they include troubleshooting, advocacy, oral rehabilitation tips. And then finally, the Professional channel, which is more relevant to you guys, is there to showcase topics for those with a special interest in severe to profound hearing loss management, as well as oral rehabilitation and cochlear implants. So they're there for you to use. You can access these through GoToStage. The links for all 3 channels are shown here, but if you want these sending out to you, then just contact me and I'll be happy to share those. Okay, next slide, please. So over and above this, what we also do, which is more relevant to you as CI champions, is bespoke training. So that's for you as champions and also for your teams. These sessions are more tailored to the individual learning needs of that particular group or individual clinician. And they can be based on any audit findings that you, where you kind of maybe highlight any gaps in knowledge in your teams. As part of this, we can also do a coaching session on how to bring up the topic of cochlear implants with your patients and how to approach answering questions that patients might ask about cochlear implants or the referral process. So again, hopefully addressing some of those barriers. We can also discuss case studies, we can offer support and advice, maybe for optimally aiding hearing aid patients, or we can help plan audits and we can help you present results to your teams. So anything really to support you and to help you gain more confidence in your champion role. We have currently taken these sessions online due to the current climate, and we can deliver them via a number of different platforms, but we are hoping to go back to in-person sessions as soon as possible, just because I feel that face-to-face contact adds a lot of value. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So Advanced Bionics has a group of specially trained AB recipients. Some of you may be aware of this. These recipients volunteer to mentor candidates and recently implanted individuals. We have over 50 mentors across the UK, so the chances are that there will be one very local to your department. Our mentors are always happy to come in and talk to both patients or professionals. They can help answer patients' questions about the assessment process or their experiences post-implant, or they can talk to you about their experiences of audiology and of their experiences of CI referral and kind of offer you learning opportunities that way. As they're local to you, they can give you an insight to your local CI team's pathways and processes, which can be really useful. So if you want to get in touch with your local mentor, you can either email myself or you can just email Here UK directly and arrange a visit. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as we are part of the Sonova group, we also have strong links with Phonak, so we can support you with bimodal fittings. And as you probably know, it's becoming increasingly relevant with the change in NICE criteria. So that's something that we can definitely talk to you about and support you with as well. Next slide, please. Pre-COVID, we hosted regular Communicate with Success days. These events are for both recipients and candidates and their families. So for candidates, we offer support and information to help those who are considering a cochlear implant or going through the assessment process. We have taken these online now, so candidates can book a virtual appointment to meet us to discuss anything that they like. We would also welcome you to attend these sessions and maybe use them as a training opportunity to gain first-hand experience of some of the questions that we get asked by candidates and their families and maybe how we address those. If you have a candidate that you wanted to refer to one of these sessions, you'd be welcome to attend with them and kind of have like a joint support session. That might help you maybe feel a bit more prepared to raise the subject of cochlear implants with your patients. Next slide, please. And finally, we also have an abundance of evidence-based resources for both professionals and patients, which might be useful to you that you can reference when broaching the topic of cochlear implants with your patients. So they can all be found on our Hearing Success portal, which was formerly known as the Rehab portal. So professionals, we have assessment and monitoring tools. We have questionnaires, which can be particularly useful for telephone triage during these COVID times. We have white papers and the latest in evidence-based practice research from the Sonova group. We have family-centred care resources and research material, and we have advocacy and transition resources for teens and adults, and we have oral rehabilitation programs as well. So if you sign up as a professional, you'll get access to all of these, but we also can provide written information that you can issue to your patients if you prefer. So if you want to know more about this, or if you would like some samples of what we can provide, then just contact me. Next slide, please. So I'll just leave you with my contact details. So please do get in touch if you want to find out about how we can help you in your champion's role, or if you want to take advantage of any of the support initiatives that I've talked about today. I should just mention as well before I go that we're also planning a more detailed introduction to CI short training course, which is going to be aimed at non-CI audiologists who have a particular interest in CIs. So that could be someone who's interested in a career in implants, or perhaps someone who wants to be more involved in CI screening in their department, or a CI champion. So if you want to be added to the invite list for that, please contact me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Had. That's really useful. So we've got next with us Rashmi. She is the Professional and Consumer Engagement Specialist at Cochlear, and she's going to talk about.
Hello, yes. Well, firstly, thanks so much to BAA and BCIG for inviting us today, and for all the huge amounts of hard work that has gone on behind the scenes to the CI Champions programme. So we're really excited to have been really involved in supporting this scheme from the start, and we think it's a really important development for audiology. It's impressive really that COVID hasn't slowed down the launch of the CI Champions, and everything has really gone online this year, hasn't it? So I'm now shopping online more than I ever did before, and in fact before COVID I hadn't really used Amazon for anything other than books, but just this morning on a whim I've ordered a chicken and an egg. Now let's see which one comes first. Okay, next slide, please, Unai. Okay, so here is a map of the UK showing Cochlear's engagement team and the areas that each of us cover. So our focus is exclusively on audiology departments who refer into implant departments. And we're really passionate about breaking down the barriers that hold patients back from getting cochlear implants. And it's true for some patients, if they don't hear about cochlear implants from you, they may not hear about it from anyone. So we really aim to empower audiologists like yourselves by providing education and support on hearing implant candidacy, meaning that all appropriate patients can be offered an assessment. Next slide, please. And Cochlear is really committed to supporting patients with severe to profound hearing loss to get the treatment that they need. So this forms part of our standard of care initiative. And importantly for you, the main focus is that you're making sure patients receive proper diagnosis and a timely referral. So a key first step has been working with all the other manufacturers you're seeing today to support the recent international consensus paper on cochlear implantation, which Anne-Marie has spoken about today earlier. Next slide, please. And there is a website that's got great resources that Anne-Marie had mentioned, and I'd really recommend to head across to adulthearing.com where you can learn more. Next slide, please. And Cochlear's engagement team have really launched the Cochlear Peer Network. So this is a comprehensive support structure for professionals like yourselves and for the CI Champion scheme. So you can see here there's many aspects to the Cochlear Peer Network, such as useful resources and counselling tools that you can use for your patients. And if you'd like more information on any of these, please do contact us. So we've really tried to create something for everyone, and our support can be adapted to what you feel you need and what you need and want in your department as well. Next slide, please. So a couple of new things which I know was discussed earlier on today as well within the Cochlear Peer Network. So we're convinced of the important role that audits have to play in improving patient care, and we've therefore developed a standardised reporting tool. So along with audit data and the input from our pilot departments, a couple of which you've seen today already, and we've actually developed what we call the Cochlear CI referral report. So this is actually a tool to allow your departments to identify and analyse patients who fall within the CI candidacy guidelines. So you can monitor what will happen to them over time as well. And here, data is power. Next slide, please. Thanks. And the idea really is that the audit tool will become freely available to all departments in due course. So the report tool has been developed for Audit Base and it's currently being finalised. And it's actually been produced by audiologists for audiologists. So we really appreciate you are short on time to run audits and you need to focus on your clinical care and patient interactions. So this is a tool that simplifies the audit process and the way that you're presenting your findings as well. So along with the access of the report tool, our team will be able to provide training materials and one-to-one guidance for you to use this report as easily as possible. So how do you stay informed of when this will be available? And I know that we had a few questions today around that. Well, please do contact us so that we know you are interested in auditing. And that's even if you're using Practice Navigator, we can still support you. Next slide, please. And 2020 has really been the year of social distance and virtual realities. So we've also embraced webinars with the sole purpose to support you. And I know that many of you have attended already. So we had over 500 of you register, and it was great to see the feedback as well, showing that the webinar content had increased confidence to refer. And your feedback has also helped us decide on the content of our current webinar series as well. And Unai, if you'd like to click for me, please. So if you haven't registered yet, we can provide you links to our previous recordings and we can let you know how to join our current webinar series. One of the webinars that you'll see coming up on October 21st will be with a panel of CI volunteers. So they are patients who already have implants and talk about their referral experience as well. Next slide, please. And finally, we can offer support and information to your patients if you think that would be helpful. So we are always encouraging these patients to get appointments in their local audiology departments in order to find out whether they may be candidates. And we can also connect these patients who are candidates with volunteers, with our Cochlear volunteers who have hearing implants and are able to share their experiences.
You could come in on the video, Andrew. Andrew is the representative from Audit Medical, and he's going to talk to us about how they can help you. Thank you, Andrew.
Hi there. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm going to take that. Oh, good. Okay. So hi, everyone. I'll keep this short and sweet because I know people are going to start getting peckish in a bit. My name is Andrew Corson. I'm with Audit Medical. You might be familiar with us from our hearing aids and our Ponto, but maybe not so much with our CI system because we're kind of the new kids on the block. So I thought I'd start with a little bit of an introduction about our history first. Next slide, Unai, please. Thanks. Okay, so I don't know who can actually guess this, but maybe we can type it into the text box. When we think of CI, we think of multi-channel electrodes that stimulate the inner ear. Who can guess what year or what decade we had our first multi-channel cochlear implant? Are there any guesses? Was it the 90s, the 80s, the 60s, the 70s? So we'll just see if anybody really can guess when it started. Okay, can you click forward, Unai? Well, we've got the 80s close, so it was 76, the first multi-channel cochlear implant, and that was by Claude Henri Chouard. And this led, next one, Unai, to a development of Neuralec, which was a French company that started Digisonic implants. Just press it a few times, Unai, so that we skip ahead. So there was a lot of development, and then in about 2012, Neuralec was acquired by Audit Medical, so they joined our family, right? And this is when we started fusing the cochlear implant technology with the digital signal processing offered by Oticon, and that's how we ended up with the Neuro system in 2015. And then in 2018 came redevelopment of the outside of it, and we have this processor that's called the Neuro 2. Now 2020, hopefully we can forget most of it, but you can hopefully keep in mind that we've got the swim kit now and also the streamer available. So Oticon Medical is part of a larger family of companies. It's known as the Demant Group, and you can see us there under hearing implants, but it's also got hearing devices, diagnostics, and personal communication included in the Demant Group. Next slide. And it's uniquely majority owned by the William Demant Foundation, so it's charity. So a lot of it is owned by a charity, and that reinvests a lot of earnings into various things and into various grants. Next slide, which brings me to the Demant Foundation dedication to research funding. So about 12 million a year. And if you're going to take anything home from today, just take those 2 links over there, screenshot the slide. There's the IDA Institutes, and there's initiatives like the Interacoustics Academy that have some great resources for audiologists to have a look at over there. This is the team. You've got myself, Mark. Is there anything? Oh no, go back. So sorry about this. The slide isn't working very well, but there's meant to be names over there. But you've got myself, Mark, and Dan at the top from left to right, and we are the clinical specialists. And at the bottom, people you're less likely to meet, but also important part of our team. There's Carlan, who's doing customer support, Shibashir, who does the research side of things, and Maxine, who directs sales. So that's the whole team. Now, in terms of how we can help, like I mentioned, we've got quite, and like many people have mentioned, we've got a lot of training and resources available online, but I want to emphasize we do a lot of bespoke and in-person, but at the moment more likely to be online, but we're flexible training for you. So do get in touch with us if you have any questions. We're a global company, so we've got global links. And if you want to get in touch with other audiology centers anywhere across the world, or you want to get access to research or certain universities, we're here to help and we're here to answer your questions. Next slide. Here are the details. Screenshot this one. I'll be your primary contact person, and there's my details over there and my email, but feel free to get in touch, and we'll do our best to help you out. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to the organizers.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Right, so I think we've got into the end of this long webinar. Apologies for running a little bit late. We were supposed to have finished about 15 minutes ago. It's not bad going considering. We've talked a lot about a lot of things. I would like to invite all the panelists back in, if that's okay. Feel free to join in on video and audio. So thank you so much, everybody. I think it's been quite insightful. Thank you for interacting through the questions. That's been really useful. And we hope that we've answered some of your questions. I know we haven't had time to cover all of them, but I think we can explore these and we can go through them, and anything that hasn't been answered, we'll try and add it to the resources. So that's a thank you from my end.
Yeah, thank you for joining, and thanks for being involved in this whole initiative. It wouldn't happen if everybody hadn't signed up for it. And there's lots of professionals that have offered support with this as well, and given up their time and volunteered resources. And I'd also recommend you go to the BSA Sound Practice website, because they've got some great resources on there that can help. So hopefully today we brought everything together. You can see all the resources, you've got all the opportunities for training. Hopefully you feel fully supported to move forward, because it is a long time till May. That's the next time that we've got formal training, but there's enough in place to support you along the way in the meantime.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Sign off then.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.